Chapter 1. The Journey West. The day Vikings discovered America. Long before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, before European maps showed another world across the ocean, a small group of Norse sailors was already standing on the shores of North America. They had crossed an ocean that most people of their time believed was too dangerous to challenge. They had no modern maps, no compass as we know it, and no idea what waited beyond the horizon. They only had wooden ships, the stars, the wind, and an almost unbelievable willingness to sail into the unknown. Around the year 1000, Viking explorers reached a land they called Vinland. It was far from their homes in Iceland and Greenland, and even farther from the Europe they knew. Their journey began in the harsh settlements of Greenland, where life itself was a constant struggle. The winters were long, the soil was poor, and survival depended on livestock, hunting, fishing, and trade. But the Norse were not people who easily accepted limits. The story of their arrival in North America is connected to several explorers, but one of the most important names is Leif Erikson. According to the Icelandic sagas, Leif was the son of Eric the Red, the Viking who established the Norse settlement in Greenland. Leif inherited his father's curiosity and his willingness to explore places beyond the known world. The journey west may have been inspired by an earlier sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson. Years before Leif's expedition, Bjarni was sailing toward Greenland when storms pushed his ship far off course. When the weather finally cleared, he saw a strange coastline covered with forests. He did not land there. Instead, he turned his ship toward Greenland. But the story of those unknown lands did not disappear. Leif Erikson eventually decided to find them. His ship sailed west into the North Atlantic. The ocean was enormous and unpredictable. Waves could rise like walls, storms could appear without warning, and a wooden ship offered little protection against the power of the sea. Yet the Vikings were among the most capable sailors of their age. Their ships were built for speed and flexibility. A Viking longship could move through open ocean, but it could also enter shallow rivers and approach beaches directly. This gave Norse explorers an enormous advantage once they reached unfamiliar shores. After days of sailing, Leif and his crew finally saw land. The first place they encountered was rocky and covered with flat stones. They called it Helluland, meaning stone slab land. Modern historians generally associate Helluland with Baffin Island in present-day Canada. They continued south. The next land was greener, with forests stretching across the horizon. They called it Markland, meaning forest land. This is generally associated with Labrador, but Leif did not stop there. The Vikings sailed farther south until they discovered a place that seemed almost impossible compared with Greenland. There were forests, rivers, grasslands, and an abundance of food. Most importantly, there were wild grapes growing in the region. They called the land Vinland. For people coming from Greenland, where trees were scarce and survival was difficult, Vinland must have looked like another world. Imagine stepping from a Viking ship onto an unfamiliar shore. Behind you is the cold Atlantic. In front of you are dense forests, strange animals, unfamiliar plants, and a landscape no European kingdom has ever mapped. There were no castles, no roads, no European armies, no familiar villages, only a vast continent stretching beyond anything the Vikings had known. Leif and his men explored the area and established a temporary settlement. They built houses, gathered timber, hunted animals, and collected resources. For the first time, Europeans were living on the soil of North America, but they were not alone. The Vikings soon discovered that the land already belonged to other people. Chapter 2. The Land. They could not keep. The Vikings had discovered a new world, but discovering it did not mean they could control it. The Norse settlements in Vinland were never going to be easy. Their biggest challenge was not the ocean anymore. It was the people who already lived there. The sagas describe encounters between the Norse and groups they called the Skraelings. These were indigenous peoples of North America. The encounters were sometimes peaceful, but eventually tensions grew. At first, the Vikings attempted to trade. They exchanged goods and resources, hoping that cooperation could make their settlement successful. But the relationship quickly became unstable. The Norse were hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away from their main settlements. Every weapon, piece of metal, and useful tool had to be brought across the Atlantic. Reinforcements were extremely difficult to obtain. The indigenous peoples, on the other hand, knew the land. They knew the forests, rivers, animals, and coastlines. They could move through the environment in ways the newcomers could not. The Vikings had technology that gave them advantages in combat, but technology alone was not enough. Eventually, the Norse abandoned their attempt to establish a permanent settlement, and that is one of the most fascinating parts of the entire story. The Vikings had reached North America almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus. They had crossed the Atlantic, built houses, explored the coastline, and survived in a completely unfamiliar environment. But they did not create a lasting European colony. For centuries, almost nobody in Europe knew that they had been there. The evidence remained hidden in stories, ruins, and fragments of history. Then, centuries later, archaeologists found something extraordinary. At Lens aux Meadows in Newfoundland, researchers discovered the remains of a Norse settlement. The site contained the foundations of buildings, ironworking evidence, and objects that connected the settlement directly to the Viking world. It was the physical proof that the stories were not simply legends. The Vikings really had reached North America. The discovery changed the history books. For generations, Columbus had been remembered as the European who discovered America. But the archaeological evidence showed something very different. Columbus was not the first European to reach North America. Leif Erikson and the Norse sailors who came before and after him had arrived centuries earlier. Yet there is an important distinction. The Vikings did not discover America in the sense of finding an empty continent. North America was already home to indigenous societies with their own histories, cultures, languages, and traditions. What the Vikings discovered was a land unknown to Europeans, and that difference matters. Their journey was one of the greatest acts of exploration in medieval history. They sailed across an ocean that could kill them, reached a continent they had never seen, and left behind evidence that would remain hidden for almost 1,000 years. The Viking adventure in America was short, but its meaning was enormous. Around the year 1000, a Viking ship disappeared beyond the horizon of Greenland and sailed toward the unknown. Somewhere across the Atlantic, its crew stepped onto a distant shore. They did not know that centuries later, historians would search for evidence of their journey. They did not know that archaeologists would uncover their homes, and they certainly did not know that their voyage would change our understanding of who reached America first. They simply sailed west. And for a brief moment in history, the Vikings stood at the edge of a world Europe had never known.